Hello, everyone, and welcome to Court with the Esquire Coach. Today, we have a very special guest joining us on the show, Mr. Matt Brown, the creator of the Extra Points newsletter. Extra Points is a newsletter that provides coverage of the off the field forces that shape college sports. And today, we're going to talk about one of the most anticipated college sporting events of the summer, and that is the return of the EA Sports college football video game. The game is set to make its release on July 19th, with some fans getting an early release about 3 days earlier. Matt is the EA Sports video game insider and has been taking his newsletter subscribers through the thrilling roller coaster ride of the video game's highly anticipated return. And Matt is here to share his EA Sports college football video game knowledge with us. Hi, Matt, and thank you for joining us.
Hey, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So before we dive too deep into the specifics of the game, I think that we should start by explaining how we got here, how we got to the return of the college football video game. And I think that conversation begins with explaining to our listeners what stopped the production of the game a little over 10 years ago in the first place. For
Sure. So
even,
what?
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, we could. Why don't we even zoom out a little bit more, even from there? EA Sports has been producing college football video games since the early '90s, back in the 16-bit era for the Sega Genesis. I actually have a copy of the first one of these games right
Oh, wow.
here. This was the Bill Walsh College Football. Before it became the NCAA football era. And I think it's important to point that out because the very, very beginning of this series, it did not have licenses from any of the schools. It didn't have licenses from the NCAA. It didn't have licenses from virtually any intellectual property in college sports. So if you were going to play as Florida State, you would show up as Tallahassee. If I was going to play with my Ohio State Buckeyes, you can't say the word Ohio State, so you would play a team called Columbus, which just so happened to have red and gray coloring. And the game sold well, and that encouraged some folks from the CLC and from universities to realize that these were very clearly stand-ins for their intellectual property, and it would be better for everybody if the licensing agreements were secured. And so those began in the 90s. The Bill Walsh nomenclature moved away, it became NCAA football, and the series continued annually as video games matured and as that marketplace expanded and they became more technologically proficient, right? So then you could actually put every single team in the game. Then you could begin to have recruiting. You could begin to have bowl games. And then what ended up happening is because they weren't able to secure licensing agreements with the actual athletes because there's no players association for college athletes and college athletes aren't employees, they wouldn't use athlete IP. They would use school IP, BCS IP, occasionally broadcast rights IP. Some of these games with other publishers would have ESPN or ESPN stuff in there. They wouldn't have the players. So the player would be QB number 5, QB number 12, RB 17. But very clearly, in terms of physical likeness and attributes and hometowns, they were stand ins for real players. And you didn't have to be Encyclopedia Brown to figure out that the quarterback for Florida, even though it didn't say Tim Tebow, this is Tim Tebow. He looks like Tim Tebow. He runs like Tim Tebow. He can't throw like Tim Tebow. And he's got the same biographical information. But Tim Tebow wasn't compensated for that likeness. So then you have the O'Bannon lawsuit, or Ed O'Bannon, a former UCLA basketball player, sued because pointing out that another, for basketball video games, EA and other publishers were clearly using his historical likeness without paying him, and had for a while, and he won the lawsuit. The judges looked at this and realized, yeah, you can't use someone's stuff without paying them, which created a problem because EA wanted to pay the athletes. Said this in public multiple times. They actually thought that would make the game better. It would add a sense of realism. But the NCAA and individual institutions looked at that and said, no, can't pay them because then they wouldn't be amateurs anymore. And furthermore, like we are unwilling to license our own IP for this project anymore, realizing that it might give us some additional legal exposure. So without real players and without some of the real teams, can't have a real game. So even though the football game was very commercially successful over the 2000s and 2010s, The 2014 edition was the last version that EA produced. There hasn't been a college football video game for consoles or anything with any kind of licensing for over a decade until now, with changes in NIL policy from the NCAA, pushed by various states passing different legislation, created an environment where EA Sports can now pay the athletes directly for their name, image, and likeness. So for the first time, current athletes will be in this game. And the way that EA is explaining it now, the game that comes out in a little over a week is going to have more representation and more likenesses of real people than any video game ever made. Certainly any sports video game ever made, which I think is exciting for both consumers and schools and athletes.
Absolutely. First I want to thank you for that history lesson on the video game. I think that is just completely awesome for our listeners to hear, and how, you made it clear, like, whereas the O'Bannon case has kind of got misclassified as the case that got rid of the college football video game, how that's not true. How it really was
No,
the NCAA's unwillingness to pay the athletes where other parties were willing, and that made the game disappear. So
that's right. Yeah,
now,
people should not blame Ed O'Bannon for this. This was not his fault. This was Mark
absolutely.
Everett's fault. Yeah.
Absolutely. So here we are now. It will once again be in the game for college athletes, and now they will get the benefit that O'Bannon was fighting for them to have, and that many college athletes' rights advocates were fighting for them to have. So it was reported, earlier this year that the EA Sports sent out a opt-in NIL contract to roughly 11,000 FBS football players. So I was wondering if you could give us some details on what offerings the athletes will get for being included in the game.
Sure. So EA, through the firm One Team Partners, the group licensing agent that also works at the NFLPA for Madden and some other group licensing projects, sent out a contract to everybody on FBS rosters, including walk-ons. So in some cases, this would go to 120, 130 people, depending on the school. And the contract stated that if you sign this is not a guarantee that you're going to get paid or even be in the game at all. We have the budget and like the disk space to include 85 players per team. And we're going to send this out to more than 85 because we don't know who's going to opt out or who's going to get injured or who might play their way into the too deep. And then, before the season, we'll include the top 85 and we'll make adjustments throughout the year. And if you opt into this deal, you get $600 and a free digital copy of the game on the platform of your choice, whether that's PlayStation or Xbox. You get the early access that the folks are paying for here. So I want to say that's a retail value of around $100, $120. And that if you opt in, you will be considered opted in at the same contract terms the rest of your collegiate eligibility, unless you specifically opt out after 1 year or 2 years or anything else. The deal does not include royalties. It does not include any escalators depending on game sales. And then EA, through Open Doors, also reached out to a much smaller group of athletes. I want to say it was between 1 and 200 athletes. And some of them weren't even football players, to get secondary NIL contracts to serve as ambassadors or to promote the game on social media. And these are, overwhelmingly went to very marketable, high-end elite athletes or athletes with very large social followings. And those contracts were between around $1,000 to, I believe, the low five figures for those secondary, marketing checks. So outside of the athletes in the service academies who are not allowed to participate in NIL activity, although EA has told me a couple of times that those athletes will still be in the game, they just weren't paid for it. That they had a separate flyer arrangement here for troops. But everybody else, this deal was sent out to 13,000 plus athletes. More than 13,000 opted in. And more than 11,000 will be included in the game. And we're getting checks just a couple of days ago. We've begun to get notices for, hey, who's going to be in the game at launch, who could potentially be added later on during the year.
That's awesome. The opportunities that are available, and I find it interesting that I knew some of, and just for my listeners, the service academy athletes are not able to engage in NIL activities, so that obviously extends to the game. But I still find it interesting that EA Sports said that they will still be represented in the game as well.
Yeah.
One
Yeah. Their coaches wanted that. Their players wanted that. You know, if they got to go talk to the Pentagon to figure out some kind of back end solution, like everybody was very motivated to get that done.
Great. One subset of athletes that you mentioned in your newsletter was international college athletes. So, how are they able to benefit, or will they be able to benefit from the opportunity?
Yeah, good question. And while, I mean, for one, I think it's important to note that while international athletes make up a very significant part of college athletics in general, they don't make up a very large portion of college football players at the FBS level. There are a group of individuals, mostly punters, that come from Australia. We have some athletes on FBS rosters from Canada, and there's a small handful that come directly from South America and Western Europe. But the percentage of international athletes and folks that are on student visas competing in FBS football is significantly smaller than it is for college basketball, and certainly for other sports like golf, swimming, and tennis, where the participation rates can be 40% or more. The way that this has been explained to me, both from EA and CLC, the Collegiate Licensing Corporation, is that international athletes are able to take advantage because this is what would be considered a passive deal. That to be participate in a passive licensing project does not run afoul of one's student visa. If you were being offered a secondary marketing contract to do other promotional work, that could, unless you were maybe doing that work back while in your home country. I don't, to my knowledge, there weren't any international athletes that were part of that secondary group. But just like an international athlete could make money from the selling of their jersey in the bookstore, or potentially their participation in a group licensing, trading card package. My understanding from everyone that I've talked to is that international athletes were allowed to participate in this program as well.
That's great that there is an opportunity for international athletes here. That's awesome. So the game's cover athletes are the University of Colorado's wide receiver and defensive back Travis Hunter, Texas Longhorn quarterback Quinn Ewers, and the University of Michigan running back Donovan Edwards. I understand that while they also have the opt-in NIL contract, that they have a separate contract for being cover athletes. Is there anything that you could speak to as far as what they were offered?
I don't actually know the specific financial amounts. I would feel comfortable saying it's at least five figures, and there was additional promotional responsibilities involved with that. When I went to the EA Studios last month to talk to developers and to play an early build of the game, Travis Hunter was there. He did some interviews. He played the game with some people. Donovan Edwards appeared in a promotional video and played the game on camera yesterday. I'm sure there was additional photo shoot or other responsibilities for Quinn that were a part of this. But because that's not part of the school, and it's not something that a nosy reporter like me can get through open records requests, and their respective agents have not wanted to reveal the exact dollar amount. I don't know. I don't know how much it was. Just that it was a different agreement, as excuse me, as is historically the case for other professional sports video games.
Well, it's certainly an unique opportunity to be able to be a cover athlete on this first iteration of the game with this highly
Yeah.
anticipated return. So the game focuses on or only has FBS schools, but I do think that there's supposed to be a mode where you can create the school that you may want to see. So if someone who is a fan of the game but went to a non-FBS school and want to create a team for the school, would they be able to, and how would that work?
Yes. So you're correct. At launch, only FBS institutions are included in the game. We can talk about the why that is in a second if your listeners are interested. But there is a tool called Team Builder, which is a web app that allows users to create their own teams, to customize those uniforms, customize their stadium, customize helmet design, and et cetera, et cetera. And those teams can be used, I want to say, in single player Dynasty mode and in private, like online head-to-head mode. And I imagine many people will use those to create their schools that are not in the game, whether you went to an FCS institution, Division two, Division three. This mode existed in the last two games. I know many people would create high schools, or they might create completely fictional universities. Uh, Alaska, for example, does not have a Division I college football team. And if you wanted to see what it would be like to take a team in Alaska and try to recruit Alaska and the Pacific Northwest and build a team that way and stick them in the Pac-12, you can do that. Um, it's interesting because the EA has gone to great lengths to limit customization options for rosters, in large part because they want to protect the NIL rights of the individual players. They don't want somebody to create a player for somebody that did not opt into the game, for example. But those protections don't appear to be there on the team side. So if you want to make an FCS team, I don't think the copyright police are going to stop you from creating Weber State or Howard or Texas Southern and using similar iconography and putting them in there. The EA has told us that user generated content is an important part of the game this year.
Great. So, there'll be an opportunity in case you don't see your favorite team in there, where you can create some version of the team that you are looking to see. So you just recently mentioned your opportunity where you went to Orlando, Florida to get up behind the scenes look of the game. What can you share from that experience? And I know that you say in your newsletter several times that this game would not be just a reskin of the Madden football game. So, and what do you mean by that?
Sure. So why don't we answer that second one first? There's a lot of consumers that are dissatisfied with the direction that the Madden franchise has taken in the last couple of years. There's consumer concerns about the strength and quality of the gameplay, about an over reliance on microtransactions, about how the game doesn't change very much from year to year. And so there's been an EA as a company, for being honest, doesn't have a great reputation among consumers, even though these games are very commercially successful. The many of the AAA non-sports games that the studio has put out have not been reviewed very well. And there's a very loud and passionate subset of the internet that does not trust this company at all. And for that, I understand. I think many of those criticisms, both for Madden and EA generally, have some real validity. So anytime, over the last 2 years, when I've written about the development of this game, people would ask, is this just a reskin of Madden? By that, meaning, is this the same, technological architecture of the last football game, just with some college marching bands and new uniforms slapped on? And I would say, based on my reporting for the last 2 years, multiple interviews with developers and people who have been making the game in Florida and elsewhere, and based on my limited experience playing it, I would be very comfortable saying it's not a reskin. They're going to share some technological things in common. It's still football. There's only so many ways you can depict football in a video game. And it is using the same game engine. Although that same game engine also runs hockey and golf and Plants vs. Zombies and shooters and a whole bunch of other things. So that doesn't really tell you a whole lot. But the game speed, the game presentation, the depth of game playbooks, I think some of the football specific things to college athletics feel very different from the NFL. And I think it would have to, because the talent differential is so much larger. It's a very different game, college versus the NFL. So I don't think that I don't know if this game's perfect. I mean, there's certainly going to be things that people can complain about, but it will feel fundamentally different from the Madden game. I played them both. That was my takeaway. I learned a lot from the event. I mean, I've written thousands and thousands of words about it on Extra Points. EA has since confirmed many of the things that I published about what to expect in this game. Now that we're getting much closer to the release date, but I can share that the experience of both Dynasty and Road to Glory, which are modes where you either take over and play the career of a college athlete, or take over be a coach and take over a program and handle recruiting and roster building and hiring a staff and all of those things. Those are the core gameplay modes of this game. And I think I know there's been an enormous amount of time and energy to make those unique and fresh and engaging and different from what we had a decade ago. If you were expecting just the last college football game with prettier graphics, I think you'll be very surprised. It's a very different, and I don't mean this pejoratively, just a very different game.
Yeah, you mentioned the two modes, Dynasty Mode and Road to Glory. So if you're choosing the mode where you can be a coach and build your own team and essentially build your own program, there are a lot of things shifting in college athletics right now, like the
Yeah.
transfer portal, potential revenue sharing from the house settlement if it's approved, and just a myriad of things. Private equity maybe making its way into college sports, which I know some of these things have happened since the development of the game, but um, how close will the reality of college sports be in the game if you choose to play in that mode? And even too from the athlete standpoint, if you choose to be the athlete and you're entering the transport for portal and things like that.
This is a great question. And I've had this conversation with several developers because I think it actually speaks to a philosophical question in game development. At what point do you decide to step back from realism in the name of fun? Here's the reality, which I'd say to everybody. If we had a college football game that was 100% beat for beat, completely accurate, exactly how football management works today, people would hate it. It wouldn't be fun. It would be a game where all you do is text teenagers, try to raise money from rich guys. It would be completely overwhelming. The pressure would be enormous, and consumers would not enjoy it. You have to be able to try to simulate these systems while also making concessions to making the game accessible, and still fun to play. So what I can share is that a lot of the changes in college sports over the last decade are very well depicted in the game, right? Recruiting now has multiple signing periods. It has the transfer portal is a very significant part of not just how you recruit, but you need to worry about retaining your own roster. How you scout those athletes is different. If you try to recruit somebody in high school, they don't commit to you, they hit the portal the next year, they'll remember your recruiting pitch. They'll remember the interactions that you had, which is an important part of how roster management works. If you're at Kennesaw or if you're at Florida International or something, you might spend some time recruiting a kid you know you're never going to get out of high school because you think, just in case this guy doesn't crack the two deep at Florida State, I'll be there to go catch him on the rebounds. And because I spent that time in the beginning, I have a better chance of getting him a little bit later. That happens in real life. That's very much a part of the game. One place I think where you'll see not as much in Dynasty Mode is about NIL specifically. I think we both know, and many of your listeners, I'm sure, know that NIL is not the only factor, but it's a significant factor in determining where individuals go to school. And what developers told me is, look, man, we started making this game in 2021. And the NIL world has shifted at least 7 times dramatically during that space. We had no collectives. We had all collectives. Now collectives might be going away. Collectives might become the in-house part of a school. We had you could fundraise money this way, but not that way, and the school could be involved, but not involved. And they're like, if we tried to shift our development architecture every time something big changed, we'd never get this dang thing finished. So we decided to make some other variables as stand-ins for NIL, but not have like managing a budget as big a factor in Dynasty Mode right now. Like it might be if you're playing out of the park baseball or maybe or football manager or something. That could change in a future game. But if you're looking at this about, okay, having to balance the resource management of where I spend time in recruiting versus development and where I'm recruiting across the country and what kind of athletes I'm trying to pursue and when I'm talking to those athletes and saying to them during the week of the season, I think that's pretty realistic. And those are more of the systems I think make more sense to be the kind of what we would call a core gameplay loop than maybe some of the other things that Lane Kiffin has to do to keep his roster together.
Thank you, thank you. Yes, that is filled with a lot of great points. It would, if they tried to keep up, they really would never finish the game.
Yeah.
So and
Yeah.
it's ever evolving. Um, I, in addition to college athletes having the ability to make money from this video game, I also read that colleges and universities have the option to cash in as well through, licensing fees and royalty payments. And I was reading from your newsletter that it was based on like a tiered system. Could you explain how this works and which schools expect to benefit?
Yeah. So one of the things I think might surprise some people is that universities actually don't make very much money in licensing from this game. The way that it has worked previously, and the same way that it's working this year, is that EA Sports sets aside a royalty pool of, I believe, 10% of sales. I don't know 1,000% if it's gross, if it's how sales are calculated. I believe it's top line from just like number of games sold. And then what they do is they guarantee a revenue share licensing payment to schools based on how many top 25 finishes they had in the AP poll over the last decade. And it's broken up into 4 tiers. So schools at the highest tier will get a guarantee check for a little over $90,000. And then I believe it's in the 60s, 40s, and like 10s below there. And because you do this by AP poll, it means that you have a couple of brands like Nebraska, for example, that I think most people would say that's still a nationally relevant big athletic brand. But because they've been pretty bad the last decade, they're tier four. They're not going to make very much money, even though they're arguably still more valuable than many, than like a Boise State or a San Diego State or a Michigan State even potentially. That will be much higher up there. And I got some emails and heard from some ADs that they weren't thrilled about that system, but there's probably no way to do it that people wouldn't be angry about. And then once the sales figures settle, if they've sold more than the initial estimation, which people in the licensing industry and at EA expect them to do, then there's a secondary payment because the bonus pool will be a little bit larger. So you get some money from the licensing. Your multimedia rights partner will get some money through EA Sports spending to market or advertise there. So some money will go to Playfly or Learfield, and depending on your school's contract, maybe some of that trickles to the institution. But the major value here, as I've heard on the school side, is less about the licensing money. Everybody recognizes that they're taking less than they probably deserve for the licensing money. The value is in marketing. The value is getting your brand in front of a cohort that is very difficult for schools to reach, specifically Gen Z, younger millennials, people who are interfacing more with games than they are with broadcast television or student sections. And this is a chance to tell your story in front of those people. And that's exposure that schools can't buy, even though they're trying.
Yeah, that is a major marketing opportunity for the universities for sure. So college athletes currently do not have any kind of royalty payment opportunity. Do you see that changing in the future?
It's a great question. And I think there's a couple of things that could change that by next year or the year after. One of those is, again, unlike the pro sports, there's no college athlete trade association. There's no union. There's no membership-driven organization that has the scale to bargain on behalf of athletes. That could change, right? Jim Cavale and athletes.org are trying to sign people up. There's been a couple of other nascent unionization efforts. It's possible collectives could band together and use that scale to try to push for something. But right now, none of that's happening. And so One Team Partners was the entity that was doing the negotiating. They were picked by EA. So there wasn't really anybody completely in the athlete's corner during this process. I am sympathetic to the idea that athletes were probably underpaid for this game. I'm not terribly sympathetic to the idea that they should be getting the same amount of money as Madden, or even the same percentage cut or the same cut as in other pro sports games. I think the value proposition is fundamentally different. But one thing that will be different next year than for this year is we know how much the game will sell. The EA was making really conservative projections about revenue because the last game was over a decade ago. And college and sports video games make revenue in other ways beyond just box sales. They make money through digital microtransactions. They make money in events. And knowing that they're going to have to spend a lot of money upfront on licensing and game development and not having a great projection about sales, I think led them to be very conservative and maybe lowball everybody. This game does 200 million in revenue, which I think is legitimately possible. It does 2 million sales, which would be an increase over 2014, but not an enormous one. I think for the first year, that's a possible number. I imagine you're going to see some pressure from schools, from athletes, from activists, from attorneys, and from some other people to go back and say, okay, now that we have this data, we can't have the same deal that we had before. But until they have an entity that has the membership to really advocate for change, they're going to be at the whims of other people.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I do think, like you said, once we get some quantitative data, there will probably be a push to go back to the table and see where there's an avenue to increase the opportunities for the athletes.
Yeah.
in your newsletter, you also reported that EA Sports is considering putting ads in the games. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, and the ads in the game system was something that EA has talked about on earnings calls, but primarily about stuff that's not sports games. Um, Whether that's monetizing loading screens, whether that's bringing in corporate partners to sponsor or present particular events. They're looking, given that video games, especially what we call like live as a service games that are constantly updated over the course of the game's life cycle, capture a lot of attention. And as anybody that works in digital media or like me could tell you, if you have attention, you have inventory for ads. That's something that you can monetize besides just access. And because games have become so much more expensive to make than they were a couple of years ago, and consumers' expectations for those products have increased, everybody is looking for ways to more sustainably and predictably build revenue. There are some ad units already in EA Sports College Football 25. Like I've seen gameplay videos. I've seen myself. I think you'll see the Allstate logo during game presentations. I want to say Discover Card is one of those partners. There were some limited ads in the previous college football game, and I think sports is different because consumers are just so used to that as part of broadcasts that if you're trying to make an immersive, realistic product, there might be some commercials, there might be some ads. When they become obtrusive, when they become unskippable, when they become as dominant as they are in a broadcast, I think then you'll see consumers begin to push back, especially because this game ain't cheap, $70 at launch. I can't speak to the specificity of what EA wants to do with ads specific to this game. I've written that I think that there are some ways you could do it that would benefit schools and benefit the developers without hurting consumers. And that's going to look different than doing ads in Battlefront or doing ads in a Star Wars game.
But so what ways would you suggest that
Yeah.
you've written about?
So
Yeah.
here's what I would say, right? I'd call up Learfield and I'd say, Learfield, or whatever school's multimedia rights partner is, like you are going out there and you're selling physical ad inventory in your stadium. And your scoreboard has ad units from local businesses or regional businesses, and you have signage throughout the stadium. And what EA has historically done is when they are depicting stadiums is they don't include any of that stuff. They might nationalize this. So there's a Discover ad everywhere, or it's generic or anything. And I would say, look, that's digital inventory. You guys, school, multimedia rights partner, EA, should get together and figure out what you would price to include that stuff in the game. And then you would charge the brand partner additional money to have your stuff represented in the digital world. And if you don't want to do that, then you should be able to go out and sell that space differently. And maybe for technical reasons, you have to do it at the conference level rather than the school level or anything. But anything that you can sell ads for in a real life stadium that's going to show up in a video game is something I think that you could potentially sell an ad in a video game.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting and potentially lucrative proposition, because so many schools are like in the college town, right? I live not too far from the University of Maryland, and College Park is all about the University of Maryland and those, small businesses there. A lot when I talk to athletes about the NIL opportunities, I encourage them
Yeah.
to look at small business opportunities. So I do think that college town businesses would jump on the opportunity to be able to advertise their businesses in the video game in the same way that they do at, at the actual game. So
Yeah.
I have one
Let's
last,
get Franklin. We got to get Franklin's barbecue in the game, right? Let's just go get
yes,
everybody up on Route 1 and put them in there.
absolutely, absolutely. So I have one last question. Um,
Sure.
so we started this show talking about the O'Bannon case, and that was a college basketball video game. Right now, we're talking about football. The only game that I know about is this college football video game. Do you think EA Sports will begin to make video games for other college sports?
Over a long enough time period, anything's possible. Immediately, I don't think so.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Court to Court with the Esquire Coach. We were excited to have Matt Brown here to discuss the return of the highly anticipated EA Sports college football video game. The game will return on July 19th. If you would like to learn more about Matt Brown or subscribe to his newsletter, you can follow him on Twitter at Matt Brown EP, and there you will find a link where you can sign up for his Extra Points newsletter. Again, thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next time.